The problem with all traditionalism in the modern world is that everyone is always aware of how chosen it is and how contingent it is and how personalized and bespoke it is. But this is why I specifically use the term neo-traditionalism and not the term traditionalism. True traditionalism doesn't make it. It's just gone. And anything that we build now that is pro-family and is religious or anything else is going to be new. And that's a big challenge, but it's a reason not to worry that you're just being, pulled back into some past.
What will survive the digital apocalypse? Just asking questions. Our guest today is Ross Douthat, one of the few people living openly as a conservative at the New York Times, and one of my personal favorite writers on Catholicism, faith, and forging meaning and community in an increasingly atomized age. He wrote a piece for the Times called An Age of Extinction is Coming. Here's How to Survive. Welcome, Ross.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming on the show.
Yeah, it's great to have you because, every once in a while you just read one of these pieces that seems to capture something about what is in the air, what is in the ether. And this is just a really remarkable piece that we will definitely link, and I recommend it, reading it to go along with the podcast. It argues that the digital age is forcing the human race into what evolutionary biologists call a bottleneck. So we can imagine this extreme, rapidly acting new evolutionary pressure, and only a tiny fraction is going to make it through that little opening in the bottleneck. So just to set this up, what are some of the biggest telltale signs that you observe leading you to believe we're facing an age of extinction?
Sure. Well, so first of all, I should say, hopefully it's more than a tiny fraction, right? You can imagine, a bottle with a thinner neck or a thicker neck, right? And,
Yeah.
one of the reasons to write
We want a
piece like
big
this,
mouth,
we want a big, we want, one of the points of sort of alerting people to these realities is to try and instill and encourage habits and intentions that get more people, more ways of life, more cultures through the bottleneck. But basically, the argument that I make is that digital life and digital existence is really, really hard on sort of what we think of as kind of normal, basic modes of cultural transmission from one generation to another, and then also sort of the literal reproduction of the species, right? And that these two things are actually connected, right? That that the way that so far we live digitally tends to distract us from the forms of creation and sort of educational transmission of literature, art, religion, all the stuff of human culture that people take for granted. Um, and it also tends to distract us and separate us from the kind of normal in real life ways of hanging around with other people and making friendships and going on dates and finding romance and having sex and having kids that also allow for the very literal continuation of the human species. And so there's a lot of things that people did sort of casually without thinking about it too much in much of human history, that people need to do with a lot more intentionality in the landscape we're in now, a landscape of sort of constant virtual distraction. And if you don't have a certain kind of intentionality about those things, then, you know, whether it's the religion that you're trying to pass on to your kids, or, the novel reading that you take for granted as what, a literate person does, or again, just the literal continuation of Spain or South Korea or Italy or Taiwan as nations, right? Um, that's the most urgent part of this is the connection to demographics. But all of that is not going to happen as automatically as it happened in the past. And you're just going to have lots and lots of opportunities to live a virtual existence that doesn't have kind of normal real world um, correlates, and this is only going to increase presumably in the age of AI. And you don't have to assume that AI will make like all work obsolete or anything like that to see this happening. You just have to assume that, AI is going to be especially good at generating, addictive slop on YouTube, or generating artificial companions and friendships that, you know, substitute for real ones. And that's already happening. And the more it happens, the tighter the bottleneck gets.
Well, I mean, I am very sympathetic to this thesis, especially because I send Zach a replica related rant approximately every 2 weeks, where I'm very worried about like the chatbot girlfriends proliferating. And I find it to be one of the creepiest, most dystopian things in the world. Like, Zach is very sick of me blowing up his DMs with my
I
worries
mean,
about
I
this.
agree with you that Spike Jones her is our future. That's our trajectory for
Exactly.
sure. Yeah.
Well,
But
and
I
in fact, you've probably actually created your own chatbot that now sends Zach those messages, so you don't even have to do it yourself. So he's communicating with a Liz
Oh
Wolfe
man.
avatar. I mean, that's
Liz
the darkest.
alarmism bot.
All of my own sort of dystopian tech columns are themselves written by a Ross Douthat AI at this point. I should just confess that up front.
But I want to sort of get, right off the bat to the heart of what I think the libertarian objection would be to your essay, which is, are you erroneously blaming a lot of these problems on technological shifts, when in reality, the thing that you're bemoaning is the fact that our cultural defaults have sort of gone away?
I mean, yes, I am suggesting that certain cultural defaults have gone away under technological pressure
Are
in
they
ways that.
necessarily are they necessarily linked though? Like, is your argument that the 2 are just intrinsically linked?
I mean, I guess my general view is that you should regard technological change as causing, well, put it this way, to use a biological metaphor, right? Like any culture contains within it multiple tendencies at any given time, right? And so technological revolutions act on cultures. They interact with pre-existing tendencies and heighten or accentuate or cause, again, like cause it. It's like causing a gene to be expressed, right? It's like saying, okay, under certain environmental conditions, some gene in your body, some gene gets expressed, right? So under these conditions, under the conditions created by the internet and the iPhone and now AI, you get a kind of um, accentuation of an already existing tendency towards hyper individualism, atomization, sort of separation from institutions, churches, families, and so on. And again, yes, all of these trends pre-exist the internet, predate the internet, and I would certainly not argue that that there's like a monocausal story here where it's just the internet driving, like, let's say, distrust of institutions. Distrust of institutions has been rising steadily in America with sort of a brief shift around September 11th since the 1960s, right? So that's a long-term trend, not driven by the internet alone. Is the internet an accelerant for people's alienation from institutions? Yes, I think it obviously is. Um, but the other thing I would say, right, is that the essay and the argument I'm making is not a kind of Luddite case for saying that, that these technologies are bad and we need to get rid of them, right? The argument is more, and I probably could have put in a few more paragraphs to make this explicit, but the argument is more that this technological change is happening, right? We're not going to have, most likely, a Butlerian jihad, Dune style, rebellion against the sentient machines or something, right? I mean, to be clear, like, I can imagine futures where that happens, but where we are right now in 2025, people are going to keep on using iPhones and keep on living in virtual reality, and people are going to adopt whatever the new AI technologies are to some degree. So, given that, we're not going to go around, smashing the machines tomorrow. Given that, it's like you need to be aware of what these new technologies are doing, and you need to focus on how human beings can master the technology rather than the other way around? Like, how do you make the use of the iPhone, social media, digital media, all of these things fit into a world where human beings keep on, making great art and having families? That's the challenge. But it's not. It's a case that sort of assumes the technological change. It's not trying to resist it. It's assuming the change and saying, okay, how do we deal with this? And how do we ensure that, you know, when this sort of when society has fully absorbed whatever the technology is doing to us, we still have human things on the other side.
Yeah, it strikes me as a very McLuhanite argument. Marshall McLuhan, who I find persuasive in this day and age to a large degree, more than I would have expected. In that technology, specifically communications technology, sort of the way he puts it is it kind of reorders the human senses in certain ways, and that then you need to have an awareness of what those effects are in order to adapt to it. And that's I mean, he goes as far as to say that this is really the prime mover in terms of creating new historical and cultural phenomena. I don't know if you go that far or not, but like one example that you give is of the way it sort of reorders the political landscape is you call it the rise of these weird bespoke radicalisms. We've got like Luigi Mangione fandom on the left, World War II revisionism on the right, and you describe it as an extinction of a certain kind of political discourse. Um, why are those two particular examples outgrowths of the digital age of extinction?
I mean, it's partially just that, again, that sort of the digital experience discourages norminess in all its forms,
Okay.
you might say, right? And so liberal democracy historically has sort of
Mm.
thrived on people being loosely engaged with politics in ways that, are sort of not, yeah, like not bespoke, right? Like that, you're part of a broad coalition that is trying to get sort of particular things done in politics and has a particular set of interests. Um, but you're not sort of sculpting and crafting this kind of hyper personalized political identity. Now, again, this is a case where, you know, you don't want to just say, this is bad, right? Full stop. Because in fact, some bespoke political identities get at real truths about the world that are lost in a world of kind of, sort of boring normie liberalism, right? And in fact, as someone who is not myself a normie liberal, um, I have a real appreciation for the ways in which the internet can kind of enliven political argument and, increase the range of available ideas and possibilities and political debates, right? So it's not as simple as saying like this new world is 100% worse because we're all going to be living, in, weird fusions of Hindu nationalism, Fabian socialism, and the Black Panthers, right? Or something, right? Like, um, but it's more that, again, you want to be aware as a citizen engaging in politics in the way that your own political engagement is being rewired.
Right.
And you want to be aware. I didn't talk about this at length in the essay, but I mean the other thing it does, right, is it creates sort of these weird politics as fandoms, right? Where you're sort of like engaging with politics, not by knocking on people's doors and doing, political canvassing or, forming an institution organized around a particular issue or something, but you're engaging with politics more the way like people might engage with, football or hockey or something like that. And clearly the internet encourages some version of this. Social media especially encourages some version of this, where it's just like, what is the thing that your main character who you're following is doing? So many influencers, right and left, clearly are sort of offering this kind of politics as fandom. Again, democratic government is not really well served by having this kind of mentality. It's not how a Republican government is supposed to work, right? So it's not going away, but you want to be aware of it, and you want to be trying to figure out how do you in your own life avoid like thinking of politics in this way, and also how do you as a senator or a congressman or someone who, takes seriously political institutions, avoid existing in that kind of landscape, because it's a landscape where it's really hard to actually get anything done politically, right? Like, I don't think it is a coincidence, again, that the internet has sort of accelerated the impotence of the US Congress, right?
Hmm.
It's not again, to your previous question, it's not the only reason that the US Congress has become increasingly impotent, but internet age politics are especially ill suited, it seems like, to sort of real world legislative deal making.
Wait, why
Yeah.
is that? Is it just because like, localism doesn't matter and it's like you can't sort of gin up enough support for something a person that's representing a relatively small contingent?
I think it's partially that local interests seem to diminish in
Yeah.
salience dramatically, right? And so politicians become less dependent on local interests even when they're getting elected locally,
Mm.
and become more dependent on national constituencies. It's that Yuval Levin at the American Enterprise Institute has written a fair amount about this, the way in which institutions in the digital environment become platforms rather than sort of common enterprises. So you see all of these, Congress people for whom being being a congressperson or being a senator is less about participating in this institution that actually exists in the real world, where you go into a building, and you follow particular protocols and you have meetings and committees and so on. You're engaged in a kind of social enterprise as well as a political enterprise, and it's much more about like how do you build up your digital reality, right?
This is sort of exemplified by Nancy Mace's big hubbub over sharing, the women's restroom, in one of the congressional buildings with trans people, and it sort of felt like something that, like, wasn't really narrowly tailored to, like, what do her what actually serves her constituents, but rather a means of making it so that the name Nancy Mace was itself sort of boosted and made higher
Yes.
profile.
Right, but it's also that her own constituents, I think it's clearly like she would not be reelected if her own constituents weren't participating in this as
Mm,
well, right? So it's not
yeah.
just that you're as a congressperson, you're trying to gain some national or even international audience. I think it also has to be the case that ordinary voters in a South Carolina district somehow they find it more real that Nancy Mace is out there. It used to be cable news hits, but now it's, creating viral videos and, showing up in your TikTok feed or whatever. That's somehow more real than Nancy Mace coming back to the district and saying, "Good news, guys. I added this, this bit of spending that benefits our district through this larger legislative compromise." I mean, it's an interesting question. Like, there are politicians who have, I think, endured and thrived successfully in this landscape on the old model. I think it's easier for senators than for um, congressmen and women for some reason. But I don't want to say that the older model has completely disappeared. But there clearly is a transition to a world where what people are looking for from their representatives is this kind of participation in the virtual drama, not the concrete legislative achievement.
Okay. The literal extinction that I think we should probably surface is that we're facing a falling birth rate. We're already below replacement rate in the United States, and this is even worse abroad. This is even worse in places like South Korea and Japan. And we're seeing this trend across so much of Western Europe. I mean, in the US, we're at like what, 1.66 births per woman. What are your
And
biggest
that's a good rate
Yeah, I mean, it's
by
below replacement.
Relatively.
It's
yes.
better than other countries are
It is.
doing. What are your biggest anxieties about this?
I mean, you wanna start by being very basic, right? Like, I like Italy. I like South Korea. I enjoy South Korean popular culture, like a lot of people around the world. I enjoy the existence of, um, distinctive human cultures or countries, right? So I would prefer that these cultures and countries not disappear. Um, I think that's a reasonable impulse before we get into other questions about like how a world of falling birth rates affects me economically or politically, right? Like it in fact is the case that right now South Korea has a birth rate it's bounced up a tiny bit. So now let's say it's at point 0.7 or 0.72 births per woman. Again, if you extend that into the future by 50 years or so, there may still be a South Korea, although North Korea might have just sort of walked in and taken it. But if you have, 50 or 60 million South Koreans today, you will have at that pace soon enough 20 million South Koreans. And you will also have a society in which the age skew is like nothing we've seen before in human history. So you'll have these societies that are sort of emptied out, actually probably intensely concentrated. People will just sort of move to the big cities, but you'll have sort of depopulated hinterlands, depopulated areas. Um, and they're just not, yes, there will still be people speaking Italian in 50 years and still people speaking Korean, but there will be a kind of actual collapse of real world nations and cultures. Again, if this trend continues to a
So
degree
you're
that
telling
I
me there's hope for eradicating the French?
well, I mean, no, the French actually have one of the higher birth rates in Europe. I'm sorry to,
That's
if
true.
you're
This is
anti-Gallic, the French are more likely to be around than the
ugh,
Greeks or the
terrible.
Spanish. No, but the French. I mean, this is, but I think this is actually part of like the weird. This is my one of my weirder theories here, but the same point that we were just talking about with politics applies in a weird way to nations. This nations that still have a certain kind of arrogance about their own importance, I do think are more likely to continue to reproduce themselves in this environment. Like the more the environment that you are in feels sort of peripheral and provincial to the drama playing out like on your phone, the less likely you are to like have the urgency to actually build things and create culture and get married and have kids. And the people in those societies who do have that agency are just going to want to leave, right? Like that's the other fascinating thing about this dynamic. In a way, people would say, well, one thing is that as population growth slows down, you'll have less migration, right? And sort of the immigration crises of our own day will abate to some degree. Maybe that's true. But if you're a talented young person in, let's say, Argentina or Chile, right? Two cultures that where I believe in both countries, the birth rate is headed down to around 1, right? So like half replacement. Would you stay in Argentina? Would you stay in Chile if you had opportunities to go to places that still had a birth rate of 1.65 and still had stronger prospects for economic growth and opportunity? I think you would probably leave, right? So I think you will see essentially a continuing emptying of areas that feel peripheral of their most talented inhabitants and citizens. This will create certain concentrations of population. And if you're in the places where population is concentrated, you won't feel the demographic decline quite to the same degree. But you will have these vast areas of stagnation and depopulation that will cover large swaths of the planet. At the very least, it will be very strange. It will be a very strange future. Like, think about all of the new cities that China has built in the last 20 or 25 years. A number of those cities are just going to sort of stand empty with like,
They
wolves
already are.
and feral pandas, right? Well, maybe not the feral pandas, but I'm trying to come up with a Chinese specific image. But there's just going to be a lot of weirdness. But I think the broad trend will be towards slower economic growth, more economic stagnation, and then a kind of the big risk is that this compounds, right? It already has in these places, and if you're a young person, you just, the, your social landscape looks bleak. You're in a society filled with old people, spending all its money on old people, right? And I guess this is, I think libertarians should care about this because libertarians generally have been humanists, have liked the idea that human beings are good. Julian Simon, yes. Paul Ehrlich, no, right? But all of the things that sort of libertarians have tended to be critical of and sort of focused on, right? Like a libertarian view has been, we need economic growth. Economic growth is good, and spending endless amounts of money to preserve an old age safety net is maybe not the best use of human resources. Well, guess what? The depopulated future is the libertarian nightmare in that sense. It's steadily slowing economic growth, and this society that's top heavy with old people who just keep voting to spend more and more money on old age retirement programs. It is, in fact, the Milton, it's the libertarian dystopia. It's
I want
just
to
been freely chosen, which is the challenge, I think.
I want to push back on this. I mean, in a sense, I think I've already sort of shown my hand because I write about this all the time on the internet. I'm pretty obviously a pronatalist. I'm a Catholic. I am a mother. I live in New York City, and I'm actually, chose to have my first child well below the sort of average rate for New York City mothers of my education status. But to try to steelman the argument that I vehemently disagree with, that is nevertheless put forth by many of my colleagues who have good reasons for believing the things they believe, is that this happens in every developed, educated society, whereas
Yes.
women amass more status, more ability to be choosy about their mates,
Well,
more, passion for their careers, higher educational attainment. They feel a sense of, when I exit the workforce or when I have more constraints on my time, there are massive trade-offs that come with that, and this is sort of an unavoidable phenomenon that we see play out over and over again, whereas women get more opportunities available to them, they make different choices than to be barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen, and it's really, really hard to get people to sort of freely choose a different alternative than the things that are available to them now. What do you say to this sort of libertarian argument of like, well, duh, of course this happens, and they're freely choosing it and they're making rational choices, and it's not the end of the world for women to want to sort of have the shackles, be freed of their shackles and be allowed to do more than they did before. Like, how would you convince a libertarian who's a little bit like, look, this was freely chosen and it's a
mhm.
sign of living in a wealthy, sophisticated society?
So first of all, I would say that's true to some degree, right? And that's why it happens to some degree everywhere. It's a universal phenomenon of wealthy and not even incredibly wealthy, just even like middle income modernity. And there is there are certain aspects of it that are just sort of a built-in feature of living in a wealthy society. A couple of things though. One is th- well, more than a couple, but let's try it. So,
We
so, so
gotta
first,
gotta
first,
keep it
so
concise.
the first point is that something, and this relates to the essay that I wrote that we were talking about at the beginning. Something has actually changed specifically in the last 5 or 10 years that is distinct, right? Where it appeared for a while that a lot of developed countries were just going to have their birth rates settle at in a range that was below replacement, but not so far below that you started talking about things like empty cities and wolves roaming in the streets, right? And you had models in places like Scandinavia where, you had sort of, it seemed like certain forms of gender egalitarianism were compatible with birth rates, 1.7, 1.8, right? Add in a little immigration, you're okay. So there seemed to be a kind of gender egalitarian model, and the United States was sort of an outlier and had a birth rate relatively close to replacement. So you could tell a story where you said, look, this issue, it's a real issue, but it reflects people's choices, their understandable choices. It reflects wealth and female emancipation, and we shouldn't worry about it too much, right? In the last 5 or 10 years, a lot of places that seemed relatively sort of low birth rate but stable have kind of fallen off a cliff, right? Um, we already talked about South Korea as this sort of lowest low. You've had a bunch of places go from low fertility to lowest low, and you've had a bunch of places, including Scandinavia, go from just below replacement to much lower fertility. And that doesn't seem to be driven by some general trend toward female emancipation. It seems to be driven by some kind of more immediate shift that I do think clearly has something to do with virtual life and smartphones and digital existence and so on, right? That is just making it harder for the sexes to pair off in the most basic way. Like a lot of this is just fewer people are there's fewer couples. It's not just like people are having used to have 3 kids and now they have 2. It's that people are having 0 kids because they don't have a boyfriend or girlfriend. They don't have a spouse. Um, and that doesn't seem like a just an issue of sort of feminism and women's equality, unless you think that there's been some kind of complete sea change in the status of women in like Norway in the last 5 or 10 years. That seems wrong, right? It seems more like something about this mode of existence we're in makes it harder for people to get married.
Hmm.
A lot of people wanna get married. A lot of people wanna have kids, right? Then that's the second thing, right? There is plenty of survey data on what people want, and people do still want kids, especially in the United States, but also in other places, right? So, people are in this environment, um, they have desires that are unfulfilled, right? So that should be somewhat concerning, I think, from a libertarian perspective. It's
Well,
not
is
just a matter of people choosing their choices. It is people have unfulfilled desires that something about this particular moment is making it harder to fulfill. And then finally, and this is the most important point in a way, right? Like at a certain point, this trend created by wealth and emancipation and equality hits a place where it undermines all of those things in a profound way. And that is where, I think everyone, but certainly libertarians, have to be concerned. If you're going from fertility of 2.4 to fertility of 1.6, I think the libertarian shrug is mistaken, but totally understandable. When you get to the point of half replacement fertility, whether people are choosing it or not, whether it's an outgrowth of wealth and progress or not, it's a big problem. It's just a big problem. And the libertarian world is not going to be sustainable under those circumstances, I think.
I I wonder if, and I wondered this as I read your piece, if some aspects of the picture that you're painting are a little too bleak. Like, will there be? I mean, some of the obvious, kind of natural solutions that seem like they would play out in this scenario is one, as we get technological progress, we do gain material wealth that it makes it easier to take care of the elderly in our society. Secondly, when people are, it's just straight up Darwinism. Like the people who reproduce will reproduce, and there will be maybe more and less fertile areas of the country and the world. And the people who are alive and living in that world really are not going to care as much about these changes as we care about what this. It's almost like there's a nostalgia that is slipping away that for us, but the future generations aren't going to care about as much. Like what one section of your essay that like really struck me about this was the part about the suburbs, because it's related to this dissipation of normiedom. You're like, we don't have, all these chain restaurants are closing down because of the millennials. Here's an articles from Business Insider that's representative. Millennials are killing chains like Buffalo Wild Wings and Applebee's. Obviously, shopping malls shutting down. You mentioned college enrollment rates kind of flatlining, maybe even sliding a little bit. Um, Yet the reality is like suburbs are the one area that has kind of survived all this. They take a lot of flack in pop culture and so forth, but suburbs, we were talking about this with Derek Thompson on a previous episode. I'll pull up this graph. That blue line at the top shows kind of large, high density suburbs are the one area that kind of has a consistent growth rate. And contrary, this picture that you're painting, it's the cities where people are leaving. So I guess my question at the end of all that setup is like, is it possible that like the suburban middle class and this normiedom, it's not really facing extinction. It's just morphing into something that's less recognizable to us when we project out decades into the future.
Yes, I think that I think it is absolutely true that part of what will just happen is that there will be adaptation, there will be cultural evolution, and there will be new modes of existence. Many of them, I agree, probably suburban and not urban, because the suburbs are themselves a good technology for child rearing. Notwithstanding Liz's admirable bravery in raising children in New York City, it is a lot easier to raise kids in the suburbs. And one of the advantages in fertility that the U.S. has over parts of Europe and East Asia is that we have a highly suburbanized society. So yeah, I agree. I would expect new models of particularly suburban existence, suburban
Oh,
family
and
existence
if I
to
could interject one thing there, I also think these technologies are sort of, I don't know, they're blurring the lines or making it like life in a big urban center not as differentiated as it used to be, because all the conveniences are there. You can get the Amazon deliveries, you can
Mhm.
get the Uber Eats, you can have access to all the same virtual entertainment at least. And so I
Yeah, Zach
think
and I
there's a
eat the same types of foods and watch the same movies, and he lives in, like, sort of Jacksonville, Florida. I live in New
you
York
know,
City, like, it's the same experience,
yeah.
roughly.
So it's like the technology is in a sense like homogenizing things in that way, and millennials, of course, are snobby about Applebee's and Dillard's. So of course that stuff is shutting down as they come of age and get more wealth. So yeah, I mean,
Well,
the-
so let,
or
but let's make a distinction between two ways in which the family restaurant might disappear, right? The family restaurant disappearing because of changing tastes is, is normal cultural churn. The family restaurant disappearing because people don't go to restaurants anymore because they can just sort of order various forms of better than Applebee's food in their homes. That's a little more ambiguous, right? Maybe it ends up being a a support for successful family life in the suburbs. You get to have your Thai food and work from home, and this makes it easier to raise kids. That's the kind of adaptation story. And there is going to
sure,
be a lot of that, right? Again, I'm not arguing that the bottleneck makes everything disappear. People who go through the bottleneck will do as you guys have suggested and use aspects of the new technology from DoorDash to Zoom calls, and so on to enable forms of human flourishing. However, there will also be people, and you can see this right now in our culture, lots of people for whom the absence of the family restaurant or the absence of like the local bar or whatever just means they don't see people anymore. And they exist in a kind of virtual bubble in which, again, they don't have enough friendships. They don't meet their future spouse. They don't do things in reality that are necessary. And those people are not going to make it. Right. And again, this is not, again, I agree. This is not the end of the world. Some people are going to make it. Some people aren't. And, I have 5 kids. Right. So I like to tell my kids, I'm like, you guys are going to make it, maybe, or at least, right. Like, I mean, their choice,
barring the AI
right.
apocalypse or whatever.
Well,
Yeah.
exactly. Their choices will be their own. But if I, at the very least at this moment, don't imagine like the things that I personally care about most,
Good.
from my own family to my local Catholic parish, anything like that, just disappearing. But I think it's good to say to people on a wider scale, hey, the things you care about might disappear if you aren't intentional about this and don't think about you need to sort of sit there and say, okay, I have DoorDash and I have streaming and I have all these things that enable, those things could enable a healthy, flourishing life outside a big city in a way that wasn't possible before. Yes, absolutely. Or they could enable a kind of shut in, sealed off, like, email job, sort of dying alone like kind of scenario, and you have to choose, right? But you have to be thinking about this as you make life choices, because the pull of the technology, I think, is away from it clearly is away from like getting together with the guys for poker night, away from going on a blind date, away from having marriages and sex, real world sex, right? It's clearly away from that, and having kids ultimately as well. The other thing though too is like, you know, it is okay to contemplate tech as, as having offering solutions that are somewhat dystopian, right? Like again, I'm not making a Luddite case.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The tech, we're going to invent the tech. We don't want to live in a stagnant world where nothing ever changes. But if you say to me, good news, all of the old people in Japan who don't have, networks of kin to care for them are going to be cared for by really kindly AI caretakers. I am gonna tell you that's a little bit dystopian, right? Like, so
Yeah.
my grandmother is 94 right now, and she's in rough shape, and she has lived by lived in various circumstances for a long time, but she had a lot of kids, and so she has a couple family members who live near her, and she has my aunt who lived in Turkey for a long time, who doesn't have kids of her own, who's now taking care of my grandmother, and it's not like the most pleasant situation, right? But I'm really glad that my grandmother has my aunt taking care of her. And if you said, good news, Ross, when you're 94, you won't have a child taking care of you. You'll have a robot. I'm going to have some questions about the
I
desirability of that future, even though the robot might be lovely in all kinds of ways.
A huge part of your thesis has to do with people's heightened risk aversion. This is an argument that tends to be really compelling to me. This idea of just like, for a lot of people, porn is easier than dating. Swiping on Tinder is easier than going up to somebody in person at a bar and taking their number and having that vulnerability component present. We see an awful lot of examples of this in parenting culture today, where it's as if people's risk aversion is the thing that's really inhibiting their ability to build a community in the blocks in which they live and to be able to build in more bandwidth so mothers feel a little bit less burdened. Like, whatever happened to the neighborhood childcare swap, that type of thing in a lot of urban parenting environments just doesn't exist today. And so parents talk about how they need to pay for cumbersome childcare and about what a difficult expense that is to put in their budget. And it's like, well, in the past, we had community technology to solve this, meaning, parents swapping out for one another. What do you think we should do to sort of increase our tolerance as a risk culture, or our risk tolerance as a culture again?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I mean, I think it is with children in particular, right? There's this feedback loop where people have fewer children than in the past for again there are sound reasons for this, right? Like modern educational culture creates incentives to hyper invest in one or two offspring instead of having four who each get less of your attention, right? And people will cite surveys saying, guess what? Kids from small families, outperform kids from larger families in these ways, and so on, right? Like,
Yeah.
but then that in turn helps create the environment you're describing around risk aversion, right? It's like, okay, well, you only have one or two kids, and you're going to be more anxious about what is happening with those kids when you're not around them. And the whole culture is going to take on this heightened risk aversion. I was in the supermarket just the other day with my 11-month-old son, who is our fifth child. And at this point, with child number five, he's sitting in the shopping cart, and I'm gonna step like 7 yards away to find the right pack of roasted chicken breast to feed to my other son. And I was not endangering my child, right? But I did step a little bit away from him. And a woman came up and he's a cute baby. She started talking to him, but then I came up behind her And she hadn't seen me because I was behind her. And she was like, "Oh, is this your child?" She's like, "You got to watch out, like I'm a designated reporter or something like this, right?" I don't know I don't even what this means, but it was basically a veiled, like, you know, I could call Child Protective Services on you. And what was striking about the encounter was not just her saying this, but then a couple of the other people nearby, as I pushed my shopping cart away, I could hear them saying, like, "Oh, I wouldn't turn my back on my kid for a minute." Right? And it's like, well, if you have
How can
5
you
kids,
expect people to
guess
have
what?
children?
You have to turn your back on your kid, especially in public space like, a suburban supermarket where presumably if someone had come along and tried to kidnap him, hopefully someone else would have noticed this random person grabbing my child. But that I'm not even answering your question because I don't know exactly how you break culturally this loop, right? Because it is
Yeah.
this loop of like you're hyper investing in a small number of children, and then you become hyper vigilant, and the whole culture takes on this kind of hypervigilance. And it may be that that is a solution that is a problem that only gets solved through cultural evolution in response to the bottleneck, right? That as children become rarer, and then the people who have children are just going to develop their own, like, having large families is already a weird subculture, right? In a way that it wasn't 50 years ago. And we are, in that way, the people who are creating the future are going to develop their own subcultural norms that are just going to be different from the wider culture's norms. I have another friend who also has a large family, and I ran into her outside, like, outside a store the other day. We know each other. We don't know each other that well, but she's like, "Hey, could you just, I got my 2 kids in the car and this kid needs to go to the bathroom. Could you just like go stand by my minivan and watch my kids?" Right. And I don't think that's something that one of my sort of friends with small numbers of children would have done. It's very much a like large family norm. And there, yeah, people are gonna, the people who create those norms are the people who are going to push through the bottleneck.
There also it feels like another type of problem where it's like it's just going to be, self-perpetuating where, like, I want to have a large family, and that's in part because I came from a big family. But if you come from a small family, you'll probably just be a little bit more conditioned to perceive of 1 or 2 kids as the default. And so kids raised in large families will just have a little bit more of this sort of familial script as to how that's done and be a little bit less put off, by that concept. Whereas the more you have children from only child or two-child families, the more they'll do that, if at all. Of course, then you also have that sort of approach backfiring, like with my husband, who's an only child, and he saw that upbringing as kind of lonely. And so now he's totally on board with the big family thing, in part because I've like hectored and pestered him about this for a long time. But, you see a little bit of this backlash, but I also do wonder, like, does this just get worse and big families just become more of this weirdo subculture?
I think it's actually going to just vary a lot
Hmm.
by
Yeah.
place. I think you can actually see this if you're a real demographic obsessive. You can sort of look at low birth rate cultures, and in some places, you have these clear pockets of large family, high fertility, usually religious populations. And in some low fertility cultures, it's that no, there's no pocket. It's that everyone's fertility is a bit lower, and there's just sort of this persistent 1.5 child per family norm. And yeah, but a lot of that is connected to the particular religious traditions, right? So I think in some Catholic countries, for instance, Catholic countries, increasingly many of them have very low fertility, right? And whatever Catholicism is doing in those cultures, it's not preventing them from sinking very low. But often you will get like a subculture of conservative or traditional Catholics who have big families. Whereas my sense is that, like in East Asia, that's less common. And in East Asia, you're more likely to have sort of the universalization of the low numbers. I do think, again, just to speak from personal experience a little bit, right? Like, I think there are ways in which large family culture can become a kind of aspirational good, right? Like
Uh-huh.
if you if you can sort of be intentional about it and successfully model the idea that it's fun and cool to have a large number of tiny human beings who look like you and your wife and hang out with you and go on trips with you and so on. Like,
Yeah.
if I'm being optimistic, I would say that there are going to be places and ways in which as that becomes weirder, it also becomes, in some cases, more desirable. And more people growing up in 1 or 2 child families will have, your husband's experience and sort of feel like, oh, this might be something that is a good thing to try, a thing to sort
Yeah.
of sign up for and embrace. And I try and be conscious of that, right? Like, it is hard when you have a lot of kids not to fall into a zone where you're talking to your friends who have fewer kids and being like, oh God, I'm so tired. I'm so tired. Look at the wrinkles under my eyes in this, in this podcast video or something. Because it actually is important to say, and I do believe this, that like cultures that give up on having kids are leaving something incredible on the table. They're leaving some really amazing part of human life and sort of letting it drift away. And there are ways in which it's good to be, as certainly you are in your writing, Liz, like an evangelist for the idea that, yeah, why wouldn't you want to have a kid a little bit younger? It's an amazing thing to have a
Well,
kid. It's probably more amazing than some of the things you could do with your late 20s or early 30s.
Zach's the IRL evangelist because he, is constantly regaling me with fun tales of stuff he's doing with his kids, like getting to coach his son's basketball team. Zach
Yeah.
is
Well,
low-key a pronatalist just in his own
Yeah.
personal actions.
Well, that's the good I mean, that is the good news about this is that, yeah, having kids is fun and cool. They're great to hang out with. And so I think, we talked with Tim Carney after his book came out on this show, and he talks about this notion of fertility being contagious. And you see areas like Israel is one counterexample to this whole falling fertility trend. You actually mentioned Israel in the piece. Well, actually, the early Zionists and also the Irish nationalists as these models of like, well, if we do want to preserve or like perpetuate and continue these cultures, then you need to look at these models of these kind of nation builders to look at what they did. And they're interesting examples. To think about. I wonder if they were facing real, immediate, like eliminationist threats, like armies and things that wanted to squash them. We are facing what you call this slow, killing us softly. It's not the meteor. It's the slow burn. How optimistic or pessimistic are you that it's possible to marshal the kind of will to construct a new nation when the threat is of that slower variety?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not super optimistic. I think the evidence we have suggests that it's just like the example of Israel is really telling. Israel is the highest birth rate wealthy society in the world by far, and Israel is surrounded by enemies and has like, this sense that it's sort of repopulating, restoring the Jewish people after the Shoah, right? And that's a very unique set of circumstances where there is a very clear and immediate threat that is clearly linked to higher fertility and general intentionality. And that's hard. It's hard to achieve that when the enemy is wealth, comfort, distraction, and technology. I do think, though, again, one reason for writing a piece like this is people haven't people haven't thought enough about these things
Mhm.
as threats, right? As threats to the continuity of things you care about. And this is why I started out by saying, like, is it good that South Korea exists? If it's good that South Korea exists, then people in South Korea should want to think a little bit more like Israelis. And this is true everywhere. Like, if you are one of the small nations of Europe and you have a particular language or culture that you want to preserve, do you think, do you think it is good that, that there is a Romania, right? Do you want there to be a Romania? Okay, then you need to recognize that Romania as a culture and language and set of traditions is threatened by forces that want to unmake it and dissolve it. And if I were a young Romanian who didn't want to move to London or Paris or Berlin, that is how I would be trying to think. And I think the more people who can come around to thinking about the future that way, the more likely it is that local customs, local cultures, and local languages can all make it into 2075 or 2125 or beyond.
You
Mm.
advocate neo-traditionalism as one sort of remedy, and I must say, I recently bought an apron, and the trouble is that when I'm wearing my apron, my sleeves of tattoos I have, like, a ton of tattoos all over, my arms, they stick out, and it's a little bit of this, like, terrifying juxtaposition of aesthetics.
It's
So,
the perfect
that's sort of
neo-trad aesthetic,
It's
I would
Neo.
say.
yeah.
That's the
Yeah.
Neo.
But
Tattoos are the
how
Neo.
but how does this function without ultimately feeling and looking a lot like LARPing?
Again, a really good question. And I I don't 100% know the answer. The problem with all traditionalism in the modern world is that everyone is always aware of how chosen it
Yeah.
is and how contingent it is and how personalized and bespoke it is. And it's very hard. But this is why I specifically use the term neo-traditionalism and not the term traditionalism. True traditionalism doesn't make it. And you see this again in cultures that have sort of that are still traditional and have sort of tried to put up bulwarks against the modern world, right? Like Islam in the Islamic Republic of Iran, it's not doing that well. Catholicism in Poland is not doing that well, right? So you can't have you have to have some kind of reinvention of the traditional that belongs fully and accepts that it belongs fully to the 21st century. And that, includes like again, you have to put to like if you think about this in terms of male-female relationships, right? Like the people online who think that we're going to have the patriarchy, whatever the heck that was, right, back, and you're just going to have trad wives, in the kitchen and taking care of the kids, and the men are going to occupy whatever role they imagine men occupied in 1870 or 1370 or whatever.
Chopping wood.
There are going to be some people in some communities that have versions of that, but on a mass scale, no. Any kind of sort of traditional Catholic or Jewish manhood is going to have to be adaptive to the trends that have created the world that we have now. Um, it doesn't mean that that sort of liberal feminism is going to make it in its current form either, right? But you have to be inventive, and you have to have in a way you have to accept that, like, yeah, you are putting an apron over tattoos, and that's okay. But the real challenge is, yeah, how do you turn that into something that your children can pick up on and imitate? Maybe that's the best way to put the challenge, right? Like in one cohort, neo-traditionalism is going to feel like a LARP to some extent, no matter what you do. So the question is, are you creating something that your children can look at and say, okay, I'm, I'm Liz Wolfe's daughter. This is like a model of how a marriage works, how church going works, how having kids works, that I can carry forward as an inheritance. And maybe that's impossible and modernity just dissolves and dissolves and dissolves, but that has to be the goal, I
That's a
think.
really good way of framing it, and I think that what you just said is such a useful corrective to the many people who think that people who advocate pronatalism or traditional religion, um,
I hear a
you
baby.
know yeah, sorry about that.
This is
No, you
neo-traditionalism in
don't
action.
have to be sorry. This is a safe
I might
space.
need to attend to that. No, but my point just being, let me see if I can get it to return. Those of us who advocate pronatalism or more people attending church regularly, there's a certain amount of like, it's as if our critics are acting as if we're, advising people to go back to this golden age that never really existed in like the 1950s. And to me, that's one of my biggest pet peeves because I'm not saying that you need to live the way that people used to, and I don't really believe that a golden age like that ever existed. It's more just this matter of like examine Chesterton's fences, examine the fences and why they might exist, why they might have been put there before you attempt to dismantle absolutely everything. And
Well,
for
and
whatever reason,
also,
people don't really grasp that nuance and that distinction.
one thing too that is distinctive about our moment, right? So I have just written this book about religion that is sort of called Believe, that's sort of an argument for people going to church, among other things. But one of the distinctive things about our moment is I don't think we're in a don't take Chesterton's fence down anymore kind of landscape. It's more like Chesterton's fence is gone. Guess what? There's no fence there anymore. Kind of seems like we could use some fencing. What can we don't want to rebuild the fence exactly as it was, but we're going to take some wood that was used in the prior fence. We're going to look back on, how that fence worked and how it didn't and so on. And we're going to build anew, right? And again, this is the important thing about any kind of traditionalism in the American context, right? Like that the world, whatever the traditional world is, that of the AI images of like the husbands and wives going to church in 1952, that's gone. It's just gone. And anything that we build now that is pro-family and is religious or anything else is going to be new, and that's a big challenge. But it's also it's a reason not to worry that you're just being pulled back into some past. It's going to be new no matter what. The aprons and the tattoos are both going to be there, I think.
Ross, last question of the show, which goes to all of our guests. What is a question that you think more people should be asking?
A question that more people should be asking. I guess just to get, since we've been talking about things like family and religion a lot and been talking less about culture, I think a question people should be asking is, how do you train your children to do things that people our age and older didn't have to be like really concretely trained to do? And that means essentially to do a bunch of things on your own without digital assistance before you start adding in the digital assistance. And this is, I think, clearest with books. How do you teach young people to read books, to read texts that are longer than a few paragraphs or even like a chapter? But I think it's also going to be increasingly true of math as well, that people are just going to sort of not learn how to do certain kinds of math because it's easy to outsource it from a young age. So thinking about education as a kind of pre-outsourcing thing, where you, before you're 18, you should be able to do X and Y and Z before you start asking the computer or the AI to help you. I think that's going to be one of the core questions facing parents and educators, how to do that over the next generation.
Ross, thank you so much for coming on the show. It was a fascinating essay and, just a fascinating topic for us to ponder as libertarians who are trying to cope with both, what is unfolding. And I really appreciate that, there is this kind of call to individual action. You can read Ross's work at the New York Times, and his new book, Believe, is available everywhere. Thanks for coming on the show.
You're very welcome. And Liz, go check on the baby. As I will go check on mine. It's also suspiciously, there's crying and then there's the suspicious quiet.
The silence is the problem.
Equally dangerous. All right. Thank you, guys. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ross.
Thanks for listening to Just Asking Questions. If you want to support the show and help it grow, please like and share this episode. Leave a comment letting us know what you think, and if you have questions you'd like us to answer or any suggestions, you can email us at justaskingquestions@reason.com. See you next time.